I have a question about that on the theological history. At what point did you have this Paul perspective on his affinity and sympathy and solidarity with Jews of what he wants for his.
Well, he was a Jew, so yeah.
Yeah. But at what point did that attitude, where was that split in that? Because you do see these traces from the early days of Christian anti-Semitism as Jews being the rejectors, Jews being demonic, Jews being the rebels, the children of Satan, or whatever you want to throw at them. Like, where did that start to happen, and where did it come from, and to what extent now is Christianity has rid itself of that? Because you speak about Christians, that is not Christian. That's not what Christians are. But I guess for me, who's foreign to it, within Judaism, you have various denominations and various cultures from different parts of the world. But I've heard Christians talk about, well, he's not what I am. They're Catholic, or it's almost looked at as different religions. Someone who's Protestant converts to Catholicism. You hear it spoken in those terms. So can you shed light on the various sources of attitudes towards the attitudes for or against anti-Semitism as rooted in early Christian theology, where that came from, and then how it manifests today?
Well, I think it's been there probably since the beginning. It has very early roots. Chrysostom was writing in, I don't know, the 3rd or 4th century. I'm not a historian, so don't hold me to that.
Jamie, pull it up. Sorry, we don't have a Jamie.
Maybe the 4th or 5th century. He had extremely anti-Semitic writings that were later influenced other very prominent and influential Christian thinkers like Martin Luther. Mm-hmm. And his writings were even cited by Hitler in some of their propaganda against the Jews.
If Paul is so revered, how does it go from that attitude towards Martin Luther? Where does that come from?
Well, there are certain, and they do this today too, there are certain texts that they will cherry pick and they will try to suggest that this is talking about the Jews as a people, as a whole, rather than just the spirit of the individuals that are being talked about there. They will cherry pick verses from the Bible to try to support this view. And they will cite the fact, and it is a fact, that, the religious leaders were rejecting Jesus as a blasphemer and calling for him to be crucified. And, the Romans went along with that to put down the uprising that they saw potentially coming. And so there is historical fact that they will cite, and there are verses that they will cherry pick. And so if you have animosity towards the Jews for whatever reason, you can find a reason, you can try to find a justification for it in those things. And once it became embedded in some of these prominent Christian thinkers, who carried weight, and Luther, by the way, didn't always have those views. Luther was very sympathetic to the Jews and wanted to see them come to faith in Christ early on. And then years later in his writings, he wrote, I think it was called The Jews and Their Lies or something like that. He started writing very anti-Semitic stuff. So,
for InfoWars, he was writing. No, I'm just kidding.
You can find justification for it if you really look for it, and that's what you want to see. But but when you actually zoom out from that and take those verses in context, and you actually listen to what Paul is saying, it is no part of Christianity to hate the Jews for putting Christ in, especially Jews today. Look at the mentality that you have to get into in order to hate Jews today for being Christ killers. What responsibility does a Jewish man today have for killing Jesus? Mm-hmm. It's like trying to blame a white man today, which they object to. These guys on the right that will do all this, they'll object very strongly if you try to hold them accountable for slavery, won't they?
Right.
Why should they be held accountable for slavery? So,
and also to externalize the Jews as this other entity in the context where everyone is Jewish or Roman. And there are political dissensions going on at the time. So it doesn't make any sense. In the theology and the story, Judas betrays Jesus. Judas was Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. Everyone's Jewish.
Everyone's Jewish. The early church was Jewish. The New Testament is Jewish. Jesus' identity was as the Jewish Messiah who is fulfilling prophecies from the Old Testament, Jewish,
so do you think
Jewish documents. So this is he was a rabbi. He was a Jewish teacher. And so, but with the early church starting as Jews who believed that Jesus was who he claimed to be, they were at odds with the other Jews who disagreed with them. And so it was Jews versus Jews until
this was family infighting.
But this is the really interesting thing. When someone who's not a Jew becomes a Christian, what Paul teaches is that they are being the words he uses are grafted in. They're being grafted into the true faith, which is the Jewish faith. He never stopped being a Jew. He never stopped believing what he believed. He just believed that Jesus was the Messiah, while others rejected that Jesus was the Messiah. So it's a continuation of his Jewish faith, where he's now latched on to Jesus as the person that he places his hope and trust in. But when other people are adopting that, when they become believers in Jesus, Paul says they are becoming heirs of Abraham by faith. And so they are joining into the Jewish religion. They're not out there in their own separate religion. Now, obviously, because there are so many Jews who don't believe in Jesus, it's like we're in different religions. But the Christian theology and Paul's theology is that non-Jews who become believers in Christ are being grafted into the Jewish religion.
Just tell me honestly, at the end of this podcast, are you going to try to baptize us? I'm just wondering.
You're making a pretty good case. I don't know.
No, but that attitude, I feel like it certainly was lost in the early days of Christianity, and there was a departure. Maybe as Christianity became more universal and people forgot the roots of it.
Let me just say something about what you just said. If what I believe, based on my beliefs as a Christian, I believe that Jesus was who he claimed to be. My attitude towards someone, like if you don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, right? Yeah. Then my the posture that I adopt to you should be one of, okay, well, let's have a conversation about that. Maybe I want to try to convince you of that so that you will also become a believer. Now, you may be resistant to that. Maybe you don't want to have that conversation. But that's the Christian heart. That's why there's always been, you talked about that, that friendly relationship between Jews and Christians, because Christianity, properly understood, has a heart of love and concern for Jews who reject Jesus. And while it may be offensive to you that Christians want you to believe what they believe, but they're out of concern and love, like what Paul was saying in Romans 9 that I was reading earlier, out of concern and love, they just want to see Jews become saved too. That's the Christian attitude towards Jews. When you see people on the right proclaiming Christ as king while disparaging Jews and calling them Christ killers and deceivers who deserve to burn in hell, that is not Christianity. So Christian anti-Semitism is an oxymoron.
So Christian, we kind of think it's this platonic love, but we keep Christians in the friend zone, and I think maybe some people are a little upset about that. It's like, hey, like we love Israel, thank you. We love the Jews, thank you. Come to Jesus. Well,
now, I mean, what would you rather have? Would you rather have a Christian who's like, hey, I think you should believe in Jesus, and I wish that you did? Would you rather hear that from them, or would you rather hear, hey, you're a Christ killer, and I think you deserve to burn in hell?
Oh, death's the former. Definitely the former. There's no question about it. And also, it's theology. So at the end of the day, like, as long as we live in a society that can respect and tolerate religious differences, that doesn't impose, then it's just a nice, fruitful, conversation.
You won't see many genuine Christians trying to impose their Christianity on Jewish people.
Yeah.
How big of a problem is the Christian anti-Semitism? Because I've seen it. I don't know. Maybe I'm not as aware of it as you guys are. But do you think it's this like real growing concern that the right has to contend with?
Yes. Yeah. And
it's
not
ascending.
because
it's seeing ascendant. I'm saying at this thing.
Not because we haven't sufficiently censored them. I was actually in favor of Nick Fuentes coming back onto X because I believe that as long as his speech is lawful, he should be allowed to talk in the public square. And if I hate what he's saying, I don't have to listen to him. And if he says something I think is wrong, I can try to, correct him. It's not because they haven't been censored enough. I think it's just because it hasn't been dealt with. It hasn't been taken seriously. I think a lot of people are turning a blind eye to it for whatever reason.
But what do you think motivates somebody like a Fuentes? It doesn't seem to be a pure religious motivation. There's clearly this sort of disgruntled resentment complex going on, or feeling displaced. And then the medicine that is religion, that provides a certain supremacy to his identity, is what's being used to fuel a community of people. And it's a weird like cherry pickup. Let's take the Christian white identity, white nationalism, and use it to make myself.
I mean, think of how appealing you can in a country where Christianity is very popular and is seen as and is viewed as a sound moral ethical system, that has good things to teach and contributes positively to our culture and society. If you wrap yourself in the language and symbols of Christianity, you can amass a lot more power and influence than maybe you would otherwise. I think there is an incentive to do that. It's very clear for the reasons I've already given that I think people are co-opting these phrases, co-opting these symbols, the symbol of the cross, the name of Jesus, to advance a very hateful anti-Christian ideology, and they're doing that for the reason of it's highly effective. It really masks who they are. It makes them seem like they are more mainstream than they are, because Christianity, besides secular progressivism, which all the cultural and institutional power promotes, what's second to that in terms of cultural influence and popularity? Well, Christian attitudes and values and people who identify as Christians. So I think it's a ploy. It's a great ploy. And they are, in fact, the deceivers. It's projection when they call the Jews the deceivers.
And what about within these sort of like elements of, are there elements, maybe you know more about it than I do, as far as like within Catholicism in particular, like there's the sort of mainline acceptance of of the papacy and the Pope and the declarations of where the stances are currently as far as the Catholic Church's relationship to Jews or any other particular issues in the Jewish community or outside of it. But every once in a while you hear about certain people that are in these sort of defected or different areas or more extremist views of the Catholic Church. I remember when Mel Gibson was making The Passion, he talked about how, it was kind of unclear to me, like what areas, like rejecting certain things that the Pope was doing, especially with regard to tolerance and coexistence with other religions. Like there's these other elements that I don't know much about, but they seem a little darker. Do you know anything about that?
I've never been in the Catholic Church. I don't have a lot of familiarity with it from the inside, but I do see that a lot of this Christian anti-Semitism, I want to put it in quotes because it is an oxymoron, is coming from people who identify as Catholic. And I don't really know what the explanation is for that. I do think that some people join the Catholic Church without really understanding what Christianity is, because they want to be a part of a structured religious system. It's very clear that they haven't fully taken on board what Christianity teaches if they're adopting that, if they're carrying with them that negative attitude towards the Jewish people when they do it. I don't know exactly why it's Catholicism that has this deep-seated problem of anti-Semitism. I'd have to look into that more to better understand that. But I do see some examples of people. I think Russell Brand has a very positive outlook, and he likes to share a lot about where he's going with his faith as he's become a Christian, and as he's starting to develop in his understanding of the theology and the practical living, trying to live out his faith. His attitude seems very healthy and positive. So it's not like it's universally, everyone is adopting these kinds of attitudes. There seem to be exceptions.
Interesting.
I don't know. Has Russell Brand ever said anything anti-Semitic? I'm not sure if he has.
No, I don't think. I mean, he's had. I don't know what he say about Israel and Palestine. He used to certainly be more on the sort of like mainstream, like left-wing views towards the Middle East. He doesn't really. Haven't seen.
He was married to Katy Perry.
Yeah.
Whose I think father has been accused of like. Again, I don't know the specific, but I think he was some kind of leader in like a very intense Catholic church who was like accused of saying some stuff. I can't back that up with anything, but I do remember.
Is Russell Brand Catholic or Christian, or did he converted to Christianity or Catholicism in particular?
I think he converted to Catholic Christianity. So interesting. He's in the Catholic Church. That's my understanding.
We'll get him on the show. We'll have a little chat.
I literally thought that was a stunt he was doing for YouTube. I didn't realize he was.
I think he seems very genuine, and he really seems to understand. He really seems to understand what he's talking about. And he's reading a lot of great books. I mentioned C.S. Lewis earlier. He's reading C.S. Lewis. He's an interesting guy. The reason Russell Brand is so interesting to me is because he's now merged this, he was hyper mystical and spiritual but not like religious. And he's now merged that with religion, but he's also like very intellectual. He likes to think about things and why they are the way they are. He's very philosophical. And so he's like this mystical, spiritual, intellectual person. And you usually see, they're usually opposites. They're usually like hyper intellectual people who are not, spiritual and mystical. And there's the people who are spiritual and mystical and reading the stars and the tea leaves and all that stuff, but they're not intellectual at all. And he's a weird hybrid of the two, which makes him an extremely fascinating character.
I'm sorry. You can trace the seed of sort of his, being curious about the spirituality all throughout for years and years, and long conversations he had with Jordan Peterson on his podcast as he became more and more into that path.
And there's no one more articulate than him. He's incredible.
He is. He's great.
Seriously, he's amazing.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. If you've made it this far, we want to let you know that Ami's House is now on Patreon. We love doing extra content, bonus footage with every episode. The best way to support us is to head on over to Patreon, become a guest, and support the show for $5 a month.
If you like watching Ami cut me off, Patreon is
Patreon.com/Ami's House for bonus content. Thanks so much for your support, and become a guest.